Hello everyone, this is Dr. Khatami. In this short video, we're going to focus learning about the plasma membrane structure. But before that, let's quickly review what a cell is and the main component of a cell. We'll talk about the cell theory, how cells are classified, and then focus specifically on one important part of the cell, which is plasma membrane. Let's start with one of the most important ideas in biology, something we call the cell theory. Cell theory has three main points. It says cell is the basic unit of life. All living things are made up of cells, and the new cells arise only from pre-existing cells. First, when we say the cell is the basic unit of life, we mean that every living thing from the smallest bacteria to a human being is made up of cells. Some living cells have only one single cell, like bacteria. That one cell can do everything it needs to survive. It takes in nutrients, produces energy, and gets rid of waste. And other organisms, like humans, are made up of many cells, actually trillions of cells, which these cells work together and each one has a special job. For example, muscle cells help you move, nerve cells carry messages, and red blood cells transport oxygen. So then remember that third point from the cell theory says new cells come only from pre-existing cells. That means cells do not just appear out of nowhere. For instance, when you get a cut, the cells around the area divide to make new cells that help heal the wound. So that is about the cell theory. Now let's talk about the classification of cells. Cells are divided into two main categories. We have prokaryotes and we have eukaryotes. So prokaryotic cells are the cells, they do not have a nucleus, but they have their genetic material, they have their DNA, but their DNA just floats around inside of the cell. This is not going to be covered by a membrane and make the organelle as a nucleus. Prokaryotes usually are single-celled organisms, meaning the entire organism is just one cell. For example, bacteria and archaea. And now let's talk about eukaryotic cells, which are going to be found in eukaryotes like animals, plants, fungi, and protists. So eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, which the nucleus holding their DNA inside. Eukaryotes can be single-celled or can be multicellular organisms. So then, as you can see in this picture, we are going to find a different name of cells. Like we have a nerve cell, a red blood cell, an osteocyte. These are the example of different cells we have in our body. So in the human body, we are made up of trillions of cells, which we have more than 200 different types of cells. As you can see, their name are different, their shapes are different, and also they have a different location in our body and they have a different functions in our body. Like the nerve cells carry messages, red blood cells transport oxygen, and osteocytes making our bone. So even though cells can look very different and perform different functions, they all share some basic features. Now let's talk about the main parts of a cell. So we're talking about the structure of the eukaryotic cells, like the cell we have in our body, the human body cells. So all cells, they have a plasma membrane which surround the cell, and inside we have cytoplasm. So plasma membrane and cytoplasm inside of the cell. So as you can see, the plasma membrane is the outer layer that surrounds the cell. You can think of it like a thin, flexible layer that protects the cell and holds everything together. Actually, the plasma membrane, it's made of phospholipid bilayer. So phospholipid is a lipid And bi means two, so it's made up of two layers of phospholipid. And also is selectively permeable, which means it controls what can go in and out of the cell. For example, nutrients can enter and waste can leave, but some substances are mostly kept out and they cannot easily pass the plasma membrane. So we call the plasma membrane as selectively permeable. And let's talk about the cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is actually the jelly-like fluid inside of the cell. It fills the space between the plasma membrane and also the nucleus, which would be found inside of the cytoplasm. Inside of the cytoplasm, you can find the organelles. So the organelles are specialized compartments inside of the cell that have a specific job, kind of like little organs. So each organelle does a particular function to help the cell survive and work properly. Some of them making energy, some of them making proteins, some of them cleaning up the waste. And then in this picture, you actually can see a picture of the eukaryotic cell. So pay attention. This is a plasma membrane. That is the membrane separating inside of the cell from outside of the cell. And then inside of the cell we have cytoplasm, which is inside of the cytoplasm. We have different organelles like nucleus, we have the centrioles, lysosome, the Golgi, we have ribosome, we have endoplasmic reticulum, we have mitochondria. So all of them are the organelles, which as I mentioned, each of them has a specific job to help the cell survive. Okay. But now we are going to focus on the structure of the plasma membrane. So as you can see in this picture, that is a plasma membrane. So inside of the cell here, and here is outside of the cell. Okay, and this is our plasma membrane, which separating inside from outside. Let's see what are the molecules making our plasma membrane. And look at these different colors. We have blue color, we have purple color, we have like brownish color, and also we have yellow. What is this blue one? The blue one is a lipid, which is phospholipid. And then the purple one is also lipid, which is called cholesterol. So one of the macromolecules found in the structure of plasma membrane is lipid, like phospholipid and cholesterol. And then we also can find these brownish color as protein. So these are protein gonna be found in the plasma membrane, and also these, let me just find this integral protein, and then these like yellow chains are carbohydrate. So if you remember, we talked about the different type of macromolecules before. We divided our macromolecules or biomolecules to lipid, proteins, carbohydrate, and nucleic acid. So the only macromolecule we do not have it in our plasma membrane is the nucleic acid. So we do not have nucleic acid here. Do you know why? Because nucleic acid is DNA, is RNA. So we do not have this stuff here. So plasma membrane only is composed of lipid, protein, and carbohydrate. But let's focus on their lipid. What kind of lipid gonna be found here? So lipids are, as I mentioned, phospholipid. Phospholipid that you can see in this blue color structure. Okay, so this blue color molecule, let me just use the blue one here, which has a head, which is a phosphate group, and two chains, which is the fatty acid. That is our phospholipid molecule. But as you can see, we have 1 and 2 layers of phospholipid. Why do we have 2 layers of phospholipid? That we call this as bilipid or bilayer. Bilayer. Phospholipid bilayer means 2 layers of phospholipid. Why do we have 2 layers of phospholipid here? So if you remember, when we talked about the different type of molecule, we said we have the amphipathic molecule. Which the phospholipid is the amphipathic molecule, okay? Which means they have a hydrophilic site, which is their site, which is the head of phospholipid, and they have the hydrophobic site, which is the other part of the molecule. So phospholipid have a polar head that likes water, which is called hydrophilic, and non-polar tails that avoid water and is hydrophobic. Okay, and we said, the plasma membrane is going to be found between or kind of separating outside of the cell from inside of the cell. What do we have outside of the cell? Outside of the cell, we have water, because 60-70% of our body is water. So we have water outside of the cell and we have water inside of the cell, right? And we have a molecule that one side likes water and one side hates water. So then we are going to have this molecule between 2 watery environments. So what can we do? We cannot have just one molecule of the phospholipid between 2 watery environments. That's the reason we are going to have 2 layers of phospholipid between 2 watery environment, inside and outside of the cell. So in this way, the heads, which they are hydrophilic, face outward toward the watery environment, and their tails face inward away from water and toward each other. Okay, so that's the reason we have 2 layers of phospholipid here between inside the cell, outside of the cell, or between 2 watery environments. Okay, so let me just clean up a little bit, and now we're going to talk about another molecule of lipid, which is cholesterol. So as you can see here, cholesterol is like a purple color here, would be found between the phospholipid molecule. So it's important to support and give stability to the membrane, and also helping the membrane to be flexible but also very strong. Now let's talk about protein a little bit. So this protein that you can see, okay, so the protein here, and then some of them would be found just on the surface of the membrane. So proteins can be embedded in or attached to the membrane. So that's the reason we are going to divide the protein into the integral protein and peripheral protein based on their location. The integral proteins go all the way through the membrane, and peripheral proteins sit on the surface of the membrane. But why do we have protein in the plasma membrane? Because actually protein has different function in plasma membrane. One of the important function of protein is going to be they are there for transportation. They act like channels or gates, letting some substances in while keeping the others out. They also help with communication and signaling inside and outside of the cell. Next, we have carbohydrate. So carbohydrate only gonna be found outside of the membrane. So if you look at here inside of the cell, we do not have any chains of carbohydrate. The carbohydrate chains only gonna be found outside of the membrane. They can be attached to the protein. Then we call them as glycoprotein, or they can be attached to the lipid and we call them as glycolipid. So some carbohydrates are attached to the protein and some carbohydrates are attached to lipids called glycoproteins and glycolipids. These carbohydrates, as I mentioned, stick out on the outer surface of the membrane. But what are their job? Actually, they help the cell identify itself as self or like foreign, and also act as receptors for signals. So the carbohydrate acts as marker or like self antigen. This is a carbohydrate's job. Okay, so now let's review the plasma membrane structure. So we said the plasma membrane is made up of lipid, proteins, and carbohydrate. Lipid can be phospholipid, can be cholesterol, and then we talked about the phospholipid structure, which is amphipathic. It has the hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tail. That's the reason we have two layers of phospholipid in the plasma membrane. And then we talked about the cholesterol, which we need them for support, for flexibility. And then we talked about the protein, which based on their location, they can be integral protein or peripheral protein, and they actually act as channels or for transportation, allow some substances go in and out. And then we talked about the carbohydrates, as we have glycoprotein and glycolipid, and they actually act as like self antigen or receptors or marker. Okay, so thank you so much for your attention. In the next video, we'll talk about the plasma membrane function.